Hi everybody, my name is Peter Laws and this is the Flicks the Church Forgot. Let me just begin by saying a humble apology that I haven't really been doing a lot of videos in the last couple of months, but I have a really good reason. This is the reason. I have finally seen my first hardback book in print. The Frighteners, Why We Love Monsters, Ghosts, Death and Gore from Icon Publishing. I've been working on this for the last 18 months, and in the last couple of months there's been a sort of final push for, proofreads and editing and all that sort of thing before it went to the printers, and the publishers have sent it off and it's come back, and check it out. It's this cool hardback, and it's a non-fiction book. I'm normally known for fiction, but this is a non-fiction book which tries to discover why do human beings have a morbid streak. If you're watching this, you probably have a morbid streak just like I do, and this is a quest to understand why. For the last 18 months, I've been traveling around Transylvania and Rome and Britain, meeting all sorts of weird and wonderful people, from vampires who drink their boyfriend's blood to people who keep their coffins in their front rooms, to me searching for werewolves in Hull and hunting ghosts in underground tunnels of hotels, being chased by zombies through nuclear bunkers. It's been a real blast writing this book, and this book is basically an attempt to explain to people why people like you and I may be interested in the morbid and macabre, and that it doesn't imply, therefore, that we like people dying in real life, but rather that we want to explore the things that are disturbing and fearful in ways we can handle, and that's what The Frighteners is all about. So it's out on audiobook, hardback, ebook, all that sort of jazz on March the 22nd in Britain, and then it will be released in America from a different publisher called Skyhorse, and that comes out in September, just in time for an American Halloween. It hopefully over the next few months it may even be translated into other languages. We'll see how that goes. But for now, Britain and America is certainly where it will be available, and it could be through Amazon and all those sorts of normal places, as well as shops and high street stores. So that's the reason why I've been a little bit busy. Hope that's understandable. But wait, stop. It's hammer time. In 1970, the British Board of Film Censors, by the way, today that means classification, a little bit less incendiary than censorship, but this Board of Censors changed the entry age of an X certificate from 16 to 18. An X certificate was there on a film to say that it was really shocking and perverse, but up until then, 16-year-olds could go and see it. But then in 1970, they changed it up to this 18 years, and my word, what a difference 2 years made. Now that the studios and the film industry had a proper adults-only certificate, then formerly taboo subjects like cannibalism, rape, incest, graphic murder could now be explored in lingering and sometimes horrible detail by filmmakers. Studio Canal have released a crop of Hammer films from the early 1970s, which are very interesting because the time they come out shows us how Hammer were able to really take advantage of this change in the certification and to put out a whole bunch of films that were really on a sort of more intense level when it came to violence and also nudity and things like that. Now, first up, I want to discuss a film called Scars of Dracula, which is just out on Blu-ray a little while ago from 1970. Now, many Hammer fans think that this is crap. To be honest, it kinda is. It's not exactly the best of the Dracula entries. There's a lot of much better Dracula entries from Hammer, but I kinda have a soft spot for Scars of Dracula. It has a crazy, nutty energy, which kinda has to be seen to be believed. Especially the first half hour of the film, which just throws in everything from bawdy sex comedy to crappy bats vomiting blood and shocking, there's a shocking zoom-tastic scene of a church filled with mutilated village women, and one of the women is just lying there, and the camera just lingers for so long on this horrible shard of flesh that's coming across her bloodied eye. And when you see how long the camera lingers, it's a complete sign that this certificate change was being taken in full effect by Hammer. Now, Dennis Waterman, yep, that's him, the TV star in Britain from the show Minder. He turns up as the slightly irritating hero, and he doesn't seem very interested to be in the film. But Christopher Lee is back as Dracula, and he is surprisingly chatty compared to previous outings. In some of the other Dracula films, he's almost mute and doesn't say a word and is mysterious and broody. Here, you can't shut him up. He's chatting away, and he's still menacing, and in this, he has some fantastic lenses, contact lenses, to which makes his eyes look purely bloodshot, but he is particularly different in this. I think by this stage Christopher Lee was getting a little bit annoyed that he was in this same character role all the time, and it does kind of come through a little bit in his performance. But this change in violence on this is worth looking in here, because keep an eye out for a really gratuitous scene where Dracula just skips the fangs and he viciously stabs his side chick with a dagger. It's actually quite shocking, because you're used to him having a sort of like a sensuous type of bite to the neck. You're not used to seeing him with a dagger going and the blood coming out and the dagger going in, but that's what happens. Again, it just shows that Hammer were taking this 18X certificate really quite seriously and doing what they could to up their game in terms of exploitative violence. So yeah, Scars of Dracula is not going to win any awards, and the production values are not that great. The castle that they're in, Dracula's castle, is a little bit rubbish, and that it doesn't really do anything new. But like I said, there is something kind of wild about it, and just let's go for it. It also has no respect for the previous ones, by the way, the previous entries in the series. It just kind of starts afresh. It doesn't sort of discuss what happened before or explain the other films. It's not part of a continuum. But it's still kind of fun, and there's quite a unique way that Dracula is dispatched in the end, or is he? You'll have to check this out to see. But yeah, Scars of Dracula, if you're willing to not be a Hammer purist and only insist on the absolute best, I think you might get a kick out of it. The next film we have is from 1971, and this was Hammer's throat-ripping and cleavage-heavy Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. This film is based on Bram Stoker's novel. In fact, it's the first time this novel was ever produced as a film. The Jewel of the Seven Stars was the more exotic title of that, but Hammer went for Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. And it does take the mummy story in some new and I think quite interesting and enjoyable directions. For a start, the gory action, and it is quite gory, we'll get to that in a sec, but the gory action skips the ancient Egyptian locale that we're used to seeing in these films and sets it instead in a timeless London, where you'll get sort of 70s record players on one scene, Lovecraftian motor cars in another, and then an asylum that looks like something out of Victorian England. In a bizarre way, it reminded me of the film It Follows, in the sense that you can't place really when It Follows happens. Is it happening in modern time, and yet why do they have so many flip phones, and why do some of the backgrounds look like it's from sort of 70s or Halloween, John Carpenter era? This film also is a little bit confusing, but none the worse for it. I quite like that timeless aspect of it. But anyway, the threat is different too. Gone are the shuffling dead blokes wrapped in bandages. They've been replaced by a mysterious, mystical ancient force that's threatening to resurrect a beautiful but evil Egyptian queen. Now, sadly, this evil force seems to have come over and slipped into real life, because this film is known as one of, if not the, cursed Hammer productions. You hear about these films, The Exorcist and films like that had bad things happening on the set. Well, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb is one of those. Peter Cushing, for example, he was set to star in this, but he had to leave the set 3 days after filming started, because his beloved wife died, and he had to go and just step back from that. And he didn't star in again, and he was placed by Andrew Keir. Then precisely a month later after that, the director of the film died of a heart attack, and this was after having a week-long bout of hiccups that the crew all laughed at, and yet after he went through this hiccup attack, he died at the end of it, which was a shock to everybody. And that wasn't the only thing that happened on the set of Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. A crew member even died in a motorcycle crash during filming. And even creepier, the film actually features a scene where a body is trapped under a motorbike, And in a sense, there's no reason why this body is trapped under a motorbike in the film. It's not related, and yet there it is. There's a motorbike landing on top of this guy. And when you know this backstory, it's one of the reasons why the legend makers say, aha, this film was cursed after all. Blood from the Mummy's Tomb is actually, I thought, a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it, and I think you might enjoy checking it out yourself. It is quite gory. Again, it uses the certificate to full effect. Particularly, there's this like so horrible bit where they chop off the ancient Egyptian woman's hand, and it's just the blood spurts and pulses in a sort of gloopy, sticky way out of these like holes in her wrist. It's very corny. I mean, you can tell it's not real or anything. It's not grotesque in that sense, but there's just something horrible about it. There's some really interesting ideas, a great score, and I like the whole mystical aspect of it. I really quite enjoyed Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. Maybe you will too. Now, the brutality continues with a film called Demons of the Mind, released in the same year as Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. The comedian Robin Ince told me recently that he called this Hammer's curveball, and I think that's the perfect way of describing this film. It is a curveball from Hammer. It comes along at you, and you're like, this is not like other Hammer films. It looks like other Hammer films, yes, but the themes and the rhythms and the way it tells its story is really quite different. You could almost call it like approaching an art house version of Hammer, but it's not that art house. It's still got all of its exploitative elements too. It's a tale of incest, murder, and the power of psychology, and for me it felt like a thematic forerunner to David Cronenberg's brilliant film, The Brood. Now, an hour into the film, I barely had a clue what was going on, but the plot solidifies itself in the last half hour, including a wince-inducing throat stabbing with a set of keys, which, oh man, I mean, like, there's moments in this film and you're like, wow, they're really going for it. It's like brutal. They also have a lingering moment where somebody is having blood sort of sucked out of them in an old medical way, where they would have this device that would slash things on your skin, and they'd put hot glasses over you to suck the blood out. There's all these sorts of like quite gratuitous things in it, which again are examples of this new certification system that they were taking advantage of. I'm not sure what everyone else might think of this film, but I found it a pretty interesting one, although it takes a little time to get into it. My favourite line in the movie is Robert Hardy looking resolute and saying, "There must be no more blood on our souls." Check it out, watch.
They say, well, there must be no more blood on our souls.
Now, finally, we have a film called Fear in the Night from 1972, which is the only one in this batch I'm sharing with you that you could really play to your kids at the birthday party this weekend. Opting for mystery over gore, this is a boys' school shocker that follows a mentally fragile young wife who has to face the beautiful Joan Collins and a one-armed attacker at the school. Peter Cushing is in this. He's in it for very briefly, but he is wonderfully sinister. But he's sad too. There's a sadness to him. Now, anyone who knows a little bit about Peter Cushing will know, because of his wife's death, he never got over that. He was grief-stricken, and he was very open about it in interviews, including something I've shared on this before, where at one point he tried to run up and down the stairs fast and fast and fast again, so that he would have a heart attack, so that he could potentially go and join his wife. It's this kind of tragic, sad tale, and you can kind of see, I don't know if I'm reading into it, but you can see a sadness in his acting in certain roles in the early 70s and beyond, but particularly, I mean, this wasn't that long after his wife had died. So Peter Cushing, even though he's not in it for very long, it's a very powerful role that he has. The story itself is bizarre and it's okay. It's a sort of French Le Diabolique sort of thriller style, and you know, this one certainly doesn't sort of go overboard with the gore or anything like that. It's more of a sort of psychological thriller, but still, it's pretty interesting and rather enjoyable. I quite liked it, particularly for Peter Cushing's role. Now, fans of motorway services, who exist, by the way, they're probably going to get a kick out of a strangely lengthy scene that is set in Toddington Services, which is on the M1 in Britain. Spotted that. And fans of vintage vinyl, they certainly exist, might also like the twirling racks of budget Marble Arch records too. Marble Arch was a subsidiary company, or a label, of Pi Records, and they put out all of these cheap things, cheap vinyl albums, and you see like a rack of those in this scene. So it's really bizarre actually having this bit of in the Toddington Services in the midst of this kind of gothic school-based action. Drawing things to a close, I would say it's just very interesting to see how tiny changes in the lore, or what looked tiny, can have massive effects on the sort of culture that we consume. And just changing those 2 years from 16 years to 18 years had a massive effect on films and horror and thrillers in particular. What's interesting is that in the 50s, Hammer, 1950s, Hammer was bringing out some films that had blood in them. The horror of Dracula, for example, one of the early Draculas, that has blood spurting in it and stuff. So it's not like they didn't have gore in the past. But as the decades progressed, as later in the 50s, you would start to see like a film like Peeping Tom, for example, another thriller that came out, that was seen as so depraved and violent and sexualized violence that censors was just so shocked by it, they did not want to allow these sorts of things to come out. And so as the 60s progressed, you saw Hammer pulling back on the gore a little bit. An example would be Curse of the Werewolf, where actually there's not a lot of gore going on in that, where there could have been, but they pull it all back. But as the 60s progressed, there started to be an awareness that films ought to be dealing with adult material, violent ones at that. And so because they changed that, that's why it became really quite a kind of an explosion of brutality and nudity and all of these sorts of things. Now, of course, detractors will say that was a bad sign, and that was going to lead to the unhinging of society. Actually, funnily enough, in this book, I argue that some of the brutal stuff we see on screen is not ruining society. It might actually be helping society. But anyway, that's another matter. But yeah, so it's just always interesting to see how changes in the law can make a difference to art and horror and scary stuff. Well, listen, thank you for listening to me for a little bit longer, talking about these 4 Hammer films. There's a whole bunch of Hammer movies out there, but these 4 particularly kind of grab the essence of those early 70s changes in the censorship. Thank you, and do remember to follow me on Twitter at Rev Peter Laws. Check me out on Facebook, Peter Laws Author, or just find me my personal profile, Peter Laws. Feel free to find that. peterlaws.co.uk, all the normal stuff. Twitter at Rev Peter Laws. And hopefully, you might be able to catch up with me again someday. But for now, thanks for listening. And don't forget the flicks the church forgot.